When it comes to facial rigging setups, in most cases, the rigs are designed so that the control elements, whether they're joints or even influence objects, they basically stay aligned with changes in the joint structure and the controls themselves, but they don't really stay aligned with the mesh itself. They control the mesh, but if you actually manipulate the mesh, the controls tend to fall away. So with that in mind, I did a little bit of research and a little bit of experimentation and came up with my own version of a nifty little setup with a few refinements to hopefully simplify it. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what I call mesh hugging controls. So first of all, I'm going to switch over to my demo mesh. Okay, so here we have a clean character with a simple joint structure. That's all I really need for this demo. Now, before you even begin this setup, it's important to make sure that your mesh is ready. Like many other setups, especially ones involving dynamics, you want to make sure that the mesh has flattened UVs. Now, it's very important in this case because the mesh is actually going to be controlling the position of other objects. Therefore, Maya needs to know exactly what the mesh looks like. And part of knowing what the mesh looks like involves the UVs. Many of the tools in Maya actually use the UVs to basically plot the location of different points on the surface. So in this case, I need to actually make some adjustments. Go to Window, Texture Editor, and take a look, and you can see that the mesh isn't entirely laid out. Some changes were made to the mesh, and so it's kind of chopped up. Now, if you aren't going to do any texturing, you can easily just do automatic mapping. And you can do that under the polygons menus, create UVs, automatic mapping, just so that Maya will flatten out your UVs. Now, ideally, you actually want to lay these out, which is what I'm going to do right now. Okay, now that we have our UVs laid out, now we can actually move on to setting up the mesh hugging controls. So now the first thing we need is a control. So I've created a little curve control. It's just made of NURBS curves. And so now we need to take that control. I'm going to Control G to group it. Okay, so we have a group around that. I'm going to call this one my control offset group. And then I'm going to make one more group around it. And we're going to call this one our control anchor group. Okay, so the control anchor group is going to basically act to anchor our control to the mesh, and then the offset control is going to function to help to negate the double transforms that might occur from some of what we're going to do. Okay, so I'm going to bring up my outliner just so it's easier to see things. So I have my anchor group, the offset group, and then the control inside. So now the next thing I need to do is actually need to take the anchor group and anchor it to my mesh. But even before I do that, I'm going to come up here, select the head. If this was an entire character mesh, besides just the head, it was all unified, then you'd have to duplicate the entire thing. But in this case, we're just going to duplicate the head. I'm going to Control D or Command D, depending on your operating system. I'm going to make a duplicate of the face. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to take my character's head mesh and I'm going to bind it into the joint structure. Okay, so I'm selecting all the joints that I think should be influencing the head. I'm going to skin, bind skin, smooth bind, and I'm going to make sure it just does selected joints. just so I can isolate the bind because I haven't done anything with the body yet. Okay, so now we have our head bound, and I think I'm going to paint the weights just a little bit so we can actually have a very clean presentation. Give me one sec. Okay, I always do like to have a nice set of weights painted so that so it's clear that you kind of want to start from a place where you do feel happy with your mesh so that you already have some good deformation happening in the surface. I mean, the addition of facial controls is to enhance that control, not necessarily to replace it, even though depending on your setup, it will replace it, but it needs to replace it so that not only does it achieve the same nice deformation without pulling those additional controls, but so that it doesn't take away from their performance, from the performance of the regular joints. Okay, so what we're going to do here is now I'm going to actually start creating the control handles around the face. I'm actually going to control the duplicate, but I'm going to put the handles on the face in the front. So I need to select my anchor, and I'm just going to start duplicating it. So currently I have two of them. There's the original, there's a second one, and I think for this demo I'll do about maybe 4 of them just to try to clarify things. Okay, so let's take our first group. I'm going to actually select the verts or a vert. Let's say we're going to anchor it right here on the top of the lip. I'm going to select that vert, and then I'm going to control or command select one of my anchor groups in the outliner. Now you need to do command or control so that you can maintain the selection in the workspace, but then also make a secondary selection in your outliner. Once I have that vertice selected on the mesh, and then the group has been selected second, I'm going to go to Constrain and choose Point on Poly. And what that'll do is you can see it'll immediately draw our control up to be aligned with our lip. Okay. So I'm using the point and poly constraint to constrain the groups of my control curves so that they actually stay aligned with the mesh. So ideally, before you actually constrain anything, you actually want to come in and rename the element that you're constraining so it's actually a bit more specific. Because when the constraint is created, it's actually going to be prefixed with the name of the object that's being constrained. So it's usually a good idea if you're going to, like I said, constrain it, name everything specifically. So lip top, and we'll call this one lip bottom. I mean, you get the idea. You want to actually label these things very specifically and then apply your constraints so that if there is a problem at some point in the future, it is much easier to track down specific elements and to basically troubleshoot issues because everything is labeled and tells you exactly what it is and where it is. Okay, so now that we have our anchor groups constrained, if we come in and we rotate the jaw joint, now you can actually see that our controls are actually moving with the mesh. Okay, so that's our first step. Next step is to get those controls to actually start to deform the mesh, not just follow it. So in the original tutorial that I watched that inspired this one, the person doing the tutorial, he actually used clusters to control the master head. But instead I want to actually use something a little more traditional, so I want to use actually joints. but I want to actually create those joints so they actually do have a 0 default. So creating the joints is pretty simple. Joint tool, snap to the grid to create your joint. Simple. And I'm just going to call this one, we'll call it joint, and we'll call it lip for now. I'll add other suffixes to it depending on where it's going to be, and then I'm going to group it so that I'm going to move my joint lip group. So I'm going to move the group instead of the joint. This way, when I select the joint, its translates will still be at 0, its rotates will be at 0. All that stuff is going to remain at 0. But the top level group around it, I can move that, and then when I click on the joint, you can see that the joint is still zeroed out. So that's a nice way to displace your joints and still maintain a 0 default, which is what I want. So now I'm just going to take this joint and move it up and align it where I actually want to control the face back here. Okay, so let's see. So we've got one joint in the front, control the center or the central area of the web, and I'll just duplicate the group, which automatically duplicates the joint inside. Reposition that one a little higher up. We'll do it again. Now I'm going to create again 4 of these, just like I did for the control curves, just for the demo. Ideally, I do a lot more for the face. I mean, basically, you could have control joints or control points, whatever you want to call them. You can have them around the eye, base of the eye, above the eye, in the brow area, in the ears, in the cheeks, in the jaw area around here, even in the nose. I mean, basically every place where you want to possibly deform the face. Okay, and one more for the opposite side. Okay, so for now, these are going to be my control points or my control joints. Because I'm going to go to each joint and I'm going to name it. So we've got this one, we'll call this one mouth left. And I'll call this one mouth right. And this one's lip bottom. And lip top. Now, of course, once you have all of the joints that you want to actually use to control the face layout around your master, then you need to basically bind the master mesh to those joints. Okay, so now I have my joints selected. I'm going to shift select the geometry, skin, smooth bind, and in this case I'm going to do again selected joints, closest in hierarchy, things like that. Let me actually make one more joint to act as sort of an anchor for the entire thing. In this case, I'll call this one my root group, but this one's basically going to anchor the master. It'll basically be essentially the root of the control system, so that anything I don't want to be influenced by my facial joints, I can just assign to that one joint just to anchor them in place. This way I don't have to worry about any strays. So I'm going to select my joints again, shift select the geometry, bind, smooth bind, select the joints, closest in hierarchy is fine, or we'll do closest in distance, we'll see how that works. Weight blending, and max influence is 2, that's fine for now. You could do 1, because I'm probably going to have to go through and clean this up anyway, so I'll just do 1, that way it'll give me very solid whites to work with, and I can create the blending I need for the deformation. And bind. Okay, so now I can just look at the mesh, right click, paint skin weights, and as you can see there's very clear and very distinctive control areas. So if I right click on this joint here and say select influence, you see that it's controlling a very specific range. Now I want to actually take most of that control. I'm going to give it all to the root right now. So I'm going to select my root joint, select influence. You see that it's controlling a very specific range. Now I want to actually take most of that control. I'm going to give it all to the root right now. So I'm going to select my root joint. I'm going to just flood it. There we go, flooding. Okay, so now the head's fully controlled by my root joint. Okay, so if I pick it up, it'll move the head. Let's put that back. Now, just like the others, it actually has a 0. See, so I can move it and it'll go back to 0. Okay, but I'm pretty much going to use it as an anchor, so we'll just leave that as is. Now, the others, we need to come in and actually give them control of very specific areas and then just paint those weights out. And I'll just quickly demonstrate that for this area. So, right-clicking, I'm going to select the top lip influence, and notice nothing's being influenced by it yet because I transferred all the influence. And so now I can come in and start giving it control. So usually if with these joints that are sitting directly on top of vertices, I will give them full control of those verts. And then as we start painting weight towards the verts that surround that central area, I'll give them a little more control. And as we go out, they'll get a little bit less control than what's closer to center. Ideally, this way, when we actually start pulling the joint, we'll actually get a nice organic deformation. And the great thing about organic deformations is the influence can actually extend out pretty far. It could even, I mean, even for this top lip, it could affect the nose a little bit, cheeks. I mean, yeah, it can just really extend out. So I've painted that a little bit. And the great thing about using joints is that if I decide that one side is better than the other, I can actually mirror the weights across so that it's actually perfect on both sides. So as you can see, I've got control of those central verts like entirely. Those verts that it was overlapping are entirely under the control of the joint. And then the ones around it respond to it rather well and give me a very organic deformation already. Okay. Now, as I mentioned before, usually when it comes to controlling lips with joints or influences of any kind, I will usually have at least 1, 2, and 3 joints on the top and the bottom lip separately. Okay, so now we have all of the lip joints weighted nicely. So we have that top lip, bottom, and of course we have the left and the right. Okay, so we've got a good range of movement out of our lips. And as I said, I would usually create joints for the entire face, but I just want to keep this tutorial pretty light. Okay, so now that we have that control set up, we want to have it affect our face here. Okay, so I'm going to select the master, shift select the main head, and then we just add it as we add the master to the main head as a blend shape. So blend shape, option box, and just to be on the safe side, you can add it front of chain. That way you make sure it's actually added ahead of the binding information, the tweak. Name it, and we'll call this one our face control blend. And we apply it, and then turn it on. You turn it on and leave it on, because you want it to always be active. Okay, so now when I grab the corner and I move it, so as you can see, it's actually moving the geometry, and since our control is actually constrained to the vertex, it's actually staying aligned with our cheek. Okay, so no matter which kind of what kind of deformation you apply, whether it's a blend shape or the use of these controls, the control will stay aligned. Okay, now the trick is to make this control that joint and also maintain its alignment. So I need to do a couple of things to make that happen. So first of all of these controls, their orientation is slightly off relative to that of the joints that we want to connect them to. So what we need to do is we need to actually select the offset group of each one. So the control offset. So basically, once you have your offset groups selected, you can do them one at a time, you can do them together. Basically, you just want to rotate the control so that it's consistent, or relatively consistent, with the global orientation, or basically the orientation of your joints. The joints back here in this face are actually reflexive of the global orientation, so we have the Y facing up, X is left to right, and Z is front to back. So you just want to make sure that your controls have a similar or the same orientation. Once that is set, then you can begin making connections between the control curves and the joints on the master control face. And so you can actually use you can use expressions to make the connections. You can use the connection editor. You can use you could use set-driven keys, but set-driven keys is very limited, which is why I tend to avoid that in cases like this. You want a lot more freedom with the facial controls. So what I like to use is one of the newer connection methods, which is the node editor. So you get a window, bring up the node editor. Node editor is actually a very cool tool. I mean, it's pretty simple. I'm going to select one of the controls. I'm going to select the corresponding joint, and then I just pretty much click on the input connections button and it loads up the nodes. Easy. In the case of the control, I want the transform node, which is the one with the little red arrow and the slanted white box in it. And then of course I want the joint. And so I'm just going to simply select a few of the primary attributes. So I'm just going to, with the two nodes selected that I want, I'm going to reload. With the node selected that I want, I'm going to come in, I'm going to try basically expand my nodes, and then I need to look for the attributes I want information from. So from the control, I want its translates to feed out to the translates of the joint on the master face. Now, when it comes to making these connections, it's usually not a good idea to do the general connection. In the past, I've had major issues where connections like this, even though they are valid connections most of the time, sometimes they will stop working. So with the node editor, what you do is you can actually make that connection really quick, but then if you want to make the individual connections beneath it, simply select the next connection and make it, and it'll automatically make the other two beneath it. So it's actually pretty quick. Instead of having to go 1, 2, 3 connections, you go 1 and 2, and it makes all of your connections for you. It's pretty simple. So now if I just test this really quick, you'll actually see that it's translating, but it's actually double transforming right now. And that's part of the last part of our process, is to get rid of the double transformation, so the controls will control the joint on the master face, but they'll also stay aligned with their default location. So let's get to that in a second. I'm just going to make all the rest of the connections just to repeat this. So select the control, select the corresponding joint, and then reload your node editor, and again connect the controls translates to the translates of your joint. And again, you could expand it so you can see the individual attributes so that you can make the more specific connections. Okay? And so for all of these, I'm just going to do just the translates. I mean, we already have connections between the control curves and the joints, but now we need to make a connection that prevents our controls from double transformation, from double transforming. Since the controls are already anchored to follow the movements caused by the displacement of the joints, they tend to move twice as far as you want them to. So we actually need to negate half of that translation. And so there's actually a very simple way to do that. So I'm going to actually use the the mouth corner control on the left here. I'm going to select control. I'm going to open up Window, and I'm going to use the node editor to actually make these connections. Okay, so I have the mouth control node right here. This is the top level transform for that. Okay, so white box, red arrow. And so now we need to actually take its translate values and feed it out to something that'll basically convert it back into a negative. And so what I like to use for that is a multiply divide node. And so if you actually right click in your node editor, you can choose create node, and it'll bring up the create node window. And then under the utilities, you choose the multiply divide node. Just click on it once and it'll create the node, and it should automatically load it into your node editor. So now what we want to do is we actually want to take our translates. I'm just going to left click on translate, drag it over, drop it, and connect it to input 1 of our multiply divide node. I'm actually going to rename my multiply divide node. I like to call it mdiv, just to keep it short. Okay, so while the translate, being the general translate attribute, which basically houses the x, y, and z, connecting directly to the general input will work, sometimes those connections just stop working for no apparent reason. So it's usually a good idea. Once you make that general connection in the node editor, you can actually left click and drag on the, let's say, the translate x, and connect it directly to the input x, and the node editor will automatically make the other 3 connections, disconnecting the general connection. This way you're sure that all of your connections are made, and it's actually pretty fast to make those 3 connections. So if you double click on your node, on your multiply divide node, or just go to the channels box, you can actually see the input 2 value, which is being multiplied times the connection we just made. We want to make that negative, so it actually creates a negative value for anything that's input into input 1. This way our output is exactly what we need to negate the extra translate value being created by the displacement of the joints. Now, however, we can't use the offset node because that's been used to adjust the orientation. So what we actually need to do is we select the control curve and we create a brand new group. So Control G or Command G, depending on your operating system. So again, we have a brand new group, and we're going to name that one too. So we'll call this one mouth, left, and we'll call it neg, as in negate. Okay? And so now we actually want to connect the outputs of our multiply divide node to the input of the translates for the neg. Okay? So just like with the incoming connections, we want to make sure we get individual connections coming in here, not the generic one, so that we get all 3 connections, X, Y, and Z, not just the generic heading. Okay, so now we have that in place. That group is around the control. Controls connect feeding into the multiply divide node. Multiply divide node is multiplying the value input value by -1 to basically make it invert, and then that value is feeding out to our negative group, which I should name it neg group. Okay, so that this transform will negate the extra translation being added to our left corner mouth control. And so if I select the control and translate it, you see that it doesn't translate any further than the joint that it's actually controlling. So technically we have a control which is actually controlling itself. But since we are negating the double transform, it doesn't go any further than you want it to. Now you see that the control actually is rotating to match the angle of the surface. That's going to happen. I mean, it feels a little weird using this control, but it does work nicely, And if you are using blend shapes, this is a nice way to have your controls follow the surface of the mesh no matter what it looks like. And you can easily grab it from the center and manipulate it that way too. And it will always feel just a little weird. It almost feels like you actually are working with clay, just because there's a little bit of resistance as it's making the calculations necessary to maintain its alignment, because it's trying to move twice as fast as you want it to. Okay, so it actually works nicely, and you can get some nice deformations, and you can always go in and adjust the weights on your master, even if you're in the middle of an animation and you're looking at your character and you just don't like the deformations you're getting. You can always go to your master, paint the weights, and just tweak it, and it'll update on your main. Okay, and you can still add blend shapes directly to your main head or to the master itself. Just a small note about this setup. While it is possible to hook your controls up to every attribute of your master facial joints, it seems to be the most stable when you limit the connections to translates and scale. If you actually add in rotation, there actually does seem to appear to be a bit more resistance when it comes to translation of the control through space. Even without the connection, sometimes it can go a little wacky if you're grabbing it from the middle. It appears to be some sort of a gimbal lock issue. So generally, you probably want to stick to using the translates and the scale when you're actually using the face hugging setup. Okay, so you can actually apply the scale, and depending on how well your weights are set up, you can actually get some pretty interesting deformations. And you could even sort of modify the character just by changing the scale. So instead of having very, very fat lips, you can give your character very, very thin lips. Or depending on where your joint is, and of course the weighting, you can completely redesign your character's face, literally just by pulling some of your control curves and changing their scale.